What family secret do you know that you're not supposed to know? Story 1. My paternal grandmother hated my mother. One day she called my mom and asked her to come over and pick up a casserole she had made for us. When she got there, my grandmother had taken her own life and left a note saying, among other things, that she wanted my mom to find her that way. She was, to put it mildly, a deeply troubled woman and one of the meanest people I've ever known. My mom didn't want people to know because she didn't want that kind of attention. My dad didn't want people to know because he didn't want to give my grandma any level of satisfaction. So it's just me, them, and maybe one other person who knows. Everyone else thinks she was just an elderly woman who was grieving her recently deceased husband. Story 2. My mom lied about how my dad died. My brother and I were told he passed away from cancer. He wrote us each goodbye letters, and I still have mine. When I turned 18, the truth came out. He died in a murder-suicide involving his wife, my stepmom, and her partner, who was also his psychiatrist. It turned out she was having an affair with the doctor. While my dad had some psychological issues, the psychiatrist intentionally prescribed medication that worsened his paranoia. When he discovered the affair, he took both their lives and then his own. Edit. For more background, my dad had manic bipolar depression. He was prone to extreme anxiety and paranoia when not on the correct medication. I don't know the exact medication he was prescribed, but I do know it made his condition much worse. His wife, my stepmom, is the one who suggested the psychiatrist prescribe that specific medication. When my dad found all the evidence, his already fragile mind completely broke. He planned the incident and left us all goodbye letters. Story 3. My great-grandma had dementia in her last years and completely forgot English. She would mumble and confess things in German, and eventually my grandma and I learned some really disturbing things about her. It took a lot of time and a German to English dictionary in the 1990s. Her oldest son's father died during the Battle of Stalingrad while she was pregnant. That was husband number 1, who died in September 1942. She then married husband number 1's brother after giving birth to son number 1. She became pregnant with daughter number 1. Husband number 2 went to fight and died in the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. Great-grandma gave birth to daughter number 1 and later married husband number 1 and number 2's cousin. Husband number 3 and she were expecting child number 3, my grandma, when he went off to fight in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. He died in November 1944. Apparently he was her favorite. At that point, no local men would marry her, and she was considered cursed. With 3 children under the age of 4, great-grandma managed to get herself smuggled into the U.S., specifically Los Angeles, during the final months of World War II. She never shared the full details, but we suspect she bribed, deceived, or otherwise found her way out. Upon arriving in the U.S. in 1945, she married a man whom her kids thought was their father. Turns out he was gay and had paid her to be his public partner. He passed away from a heart attack in 1960, and she never remarried. Somehow, all 3 children have U.S. birth certificates listing husband number 4 as their father. We have no idea how great-grandma pulled that off. Story 4. My mom told a man I was his son and regularly asked him for money, claiming she needed it to raise me. I found out when he showed up with gifts shortly after I had moved out on my own. He had hired a private investigator after my mom refused to give him my contact info. He apologized for not being in my life and cried while telling me he was dying of pancreatic cancer and didn't want to pass away without meeting me. I asked my mom about it, and she admitted she told him that so she could get money for drugs after she left my dad. DNA tests later confirmed he was not my father. I compared my DNA to the man I was always told was my biological dad. I only met that man once. I accepted the gifts because the experience was so surreal that I didn't know how to say anything except that I forgave him. My mom is the only other person who knows this happened. Story 5. My older brother might actually be my half-brother. About 10 years ago, I went out drinking with my dad for his birthday. He got very drunk and told me that when he and my mom first got together, she was still involved with a very abusive man. She became pregnant around the time she left him. So there's about a 50-50 chance that my older brother is actually that man's son. I asked if he'd ever thought about getting a paternity test, and he said, "No, I don't care what any test says. That is my son." He also got emotional and told me he regretted talking me out of pursuing my original career path. Later, he punched a jukebox because he thought it would be funny. The whole night was a roller coaster. The next day, he didn't seem to remember anything he told me about my brother, and I never brought it up again. I'll never tell my brother, and I'll never tell my parents that I know. As a side note, it does explain a lot. My brother and I don't even look alike, but we always just shrugged it off whenever friends asked how we could be siblings. I feel the same way my dad does. He's my brother, not half-brother, no matter what a test says. I've made peace with the fact that I'll never know for sure. Story 6. I have faint memories from when I was a kid of an aunt on my father's side. I remember her being thin and sad with blonde hair. No one would talk to me about her, and I didn't remember a name until one day the name Karen just hit me. Don't laugh. This was the 70s, and Karens weren't really a thing. Neither my older nor younger siblings remember her, and no one would talk about her. No pictures, nothing. About 2 years before his death in 2018, I was talking to my grandfather and looking through pictures with him when I found the woman from my memories and asked about her. My father had a sister, Karen. She was born in 1948. When she was a baby, my grandfather took her out to his woodworking shop just to hang out with him while he worked. He sat her on a workbench, turned to grab some tools, and turned around just in time to see her hit the floor head first. He said he'd remember the sound for the rest of his life, like dropping a watermelon. They took her to the local doctor, but he said he didn't find anything wrong. For the rest of her life, she suffered from debilitating headaches and later schizophrenia. When she was 26, she called him from a city about 6 hours away, from a payphone. She was sobbing about voices that wouldn't stop talking and said she couldn't take it anymore. He immediately jumped in his car and made it there in 4 hours, but the police had already found her deceased in her car with a hose running from the exhaust pipe into a window. I am the only one who seems to know she existed. My mother doesn't remember her or denies it. My dad passed away. Both grandparents are gone too. But I remember her face and her telling me it was okay to be sad. Grandpa said she was always interested in me. I'm neurodivergent and really struggled with social skills as a child. I think that made her feel less alone. Story 7. My dad's biological father is actually his adopted father's brother, so his uncle. His biological dad and his girlfriend were both underage, and she ended up having a baby. In order to keep it hush-hush, she gave the baby to her boyfriend's brother, who was of age and married. My dad doesn't know this. Also, my sister is only my half-sister. My parents were swingers and my mom got pregnant when they were trying for a baby, but somehow she conceived by someone else instead. My dad is somewhat aware, but the real father doesn't know, nor does my sister. It gets even crazier. They lost all contact with the man, but when my sister turned 20 and moved out to live with her husband in a new state, she got a job and moved around within the company. She became close friends outside of work with her boss, who just so happens to be her biological father. Story 8. I always wondered why my grandmother hated my aunt, her older sister. She was a devoted Christian woman who even co-owned a church with her husband. My aunt did a lot for my grandma while she was deathly sick, so when she said she didn't want my aunt anywhere near her deathbed or at her funeral, it confused me. I asked why, but she made it very clear that she didn't want her around. My grandma raised me. We were best friends, and I was her first and favorite grandchild. She always told me not to tell anyone, that it was our little secret because it would hurt the other grandkids' feelings. My cousins even told me after she passed that they all knew I was the favorite because of the unbreakable bond we had. So when family started asking me why my aunt wasn't allowed near her deathbed or at the funeral, I said I didn't really know. I just knew I would make sure her last wishes were honored. My first job in high school was working for my grandma's best friend from middle and high school. They had a falling out because my grandma went down the wrong path after high school and never really reconnected, except for an occasional hello in CVS. We crossed paths not too long ago and shared memories about my grandma. We talked about what I'm doing now. She then asked, "How were you able to keep a straight face around your aunt after all those fake Facebook posts she puts up about your grandma after what she did?" I knew my aunt had done something when they were younger, but I was never told the full story and didn't push. She told me that my aunt had assaulted my grandma when she was between the ages of 10 and 13, and my aunt was 14 to 17. She would even let some of her boyfriends take advantage of her while their parents were away at work. I cried for my grandma. She wasn't perfect, but she didn't deserve that pain, and she carried it until her dying breath. She was only 68. Her friend thought I would already know because of how close we were. It all made sense at that moment. Why my grandma acted the way she did around my aunt, and why my aunt always tried to do everything for her, maybe to make up for what she had done. I told her friend not to tell anyone else, and she hasn't until she told me. I blocked my aunt and almost that entire side of the family. I was already no contact with my biological mom and dad. I know my grandma was proud of me for getting out of that toxic little town and away from everyone who hurt me, but I wish she had been able to do that too. Away from her sister, from her broken children, and from our broken family. I wish I could have taken her with me. If she hadn't been so sick, I would have. I will never tell a soul, except all of Reddit. I know that if this ever came out, it would cause a war in that small town because my aunt is a very respected woman, but she knows what she did, and she has to live with the knowledge that she traumatized her sister until the day she died. I believe she'll carry that to her own grave. I imagine my grandma haunting her, and I smile. I hope my grandma finally got the peace she always deserved. Story 9. My uncle was married around 8 times and had 2 kids, until we found out after he passed away that he actually had about 7 other kids from different relationships we never knew about. He was a truck driver in the 90s. He drove all over the U.S. and had affairs with different women in other states. We discovered the other kids through Ancestry.com. I've met a couple of them. My great-aunt was in a mental institution for most of her life. I never got to meet her. She suffered a breakdown after the love of her life was tragically killed. She was only 18 at the time. Her family admitted her to a mental institution, thinking it would only be for a year or so. She ended up staying for 30 years. The day she was discharged, she disappeared, and no one knew what happened until she was found at an abandoned house. She had taken her own life. Storytime. Nobody had the details right, but my paternal great-grandfather killed the son of a police officer in St. Louis in 1901 when he was 17. He ran away from home, ended up in Omaha, and changed his last name. I confirmed all of this using Ancestry and newspapers.com. It was labeled an accident, but he and his brother were known troublemakers, and street gangs were common in 1901 Street Louis, some of which targeted police officers and their families. Several articles covered the event. He also lied and told relatives he was a police officer. He never was. He worked as a security guard at a produce company. His mother likely had an affair with a neighbor boy, which would make my great-grandfather illegitimate. Using 1880 census records, I was able to reach that possible conclusion. It's all a mess, and I'm determined to get to the bottom of it. Story 11. My maternal great-uncle worked for the Canadian Department of Defense during the Cold War and died of a heart attack while stationed in Germany. When my mom told me, I pointed out that it was very possible he was assassinated because it actually isn't hard to make a death look like a heart attack. My mom dismissed it pretty quickly. My grandmother, who was a nurse at the time, went to identify the body because her sister didn't have the strength. Later, I brought up the theory in private and asked her what she thought. She didn't say anything, just nodded and gave me this really knowing look. His death isn't really talked about in the family, but I found out at my grandfather's memorial that I'm the only one, besides my grandmother, who knows. My paternal great-grandmother was assaulted in Belarus, her home country, and became pregnant as a result before immigrating to Canada. So my great-uncle is actually my grandfather's half-brother, and his biological father was a man in the Russian army. His mother told him the truth on her deathbed, and he told me on his. I don't know if anyone else knows, but no one has ever said anything. Lastly, when my paternal great-grandparents came to Canada, they were placed in internment camps. I only found out because my great-aunt got very drunk one night and ranted about how the Canadian government wants people to forget about residential schools and the internment camps they ran or supported. Story 12. My mom and dad divorced in the 90s, and my dad remarried a very difficult woman a few years later. They moved back to my state and treated my family terribly, even though he gave full custody to my mom, and she still allowed us to visit him. They moved out of state and didn't contact us for 13 years. My brother's then-girlfriend encouraged him to reconcile with our dad, even though his wife was still very difficult. My dad came back to visit, and my mom, who had recently divorced, slept with him because he was unhappy in his marriage but afraid to leave and lose access to his son. Strange, I know. She told me she did it as payback for all the things his wife put our family through. No one on either side of the family knows this. and my dad doesn't know I know. He's told me I'm going to hell, in more words, for my sins, but that he and the rest of the family will be in heaven. I'm pretty sure adultery is a sin too, so I guess we'll be bunking together in that glorious heat, Dad. Story 13. My older brother was severely abused by his stepfather and mother, who had custody of him. My father repeatedly tried to gain custody, but at the time he was a low-paid, single blue-collar worker, and she was a nurse married to a professional. They had 3 children together. My dad knew it wasn't a happy home, but didn't know about the abuse. He continued to fight for custody, but the courts only allowed visitation and occasional overnights and holidays. My father worked more than 10 hours a day while going to college, solely to gain custody, which he finally did in my brother's early teens. But by then, it was too late. My brother had already gone off the rails. For about 15 years, he was essentially a homeless, addicted drifter after running away at 17. He has told me everything, but he's never told anyone else and swore me to secrecy. Story 14. My grandfather was a Montford Point Marine. He fought in World War II when integration was allowed. He also served in the Korean War and was one of only 2 gunnery sergeants to survive from his platoon in the Chosin Reservoir. He literally survived by pulling his partner's body on top of himself and continuing to shoot. The Netflix documentary The Chosen Frozen was about him and his comrades. He lived to be 98 and passed away in 2007. He was buried with high honors in Quantico National Cemetery. However, he also had a deeply disturbing side. He was a serial abuser. My big brother was actually my uncle. My grandmother adopted him, and an aunt was actually his child with his wife's younger sister. My mother and aunts are severely mentally and emotionally damaged, as he was harming all of them. They lived very difficult and abusive lives, and the trauma continued into the next generation. I found out after watching a Maury Povich episode comparing old family photos and finally asking the hard questions after he passed. I was already the scapegoat in the family, so I ordered his birth certificate, made copies, and created a Maury-style "You Are the Father" meme with the pictures. Sorry, not sorry. There are photos of my mom visibly pregnant. She was only 13, but her birth certificate lists my grandparents, who were 55 and 64, as the parents. That boy was his first son. He died at 6 from drowning. I was a toddler then, but I have photos of us together. I've been no contact for years because of the harm I experienced from my maternal family. Now I understand where it all came from. My adult younger brother got a tattoo of Chosen Frozen on his forearm to honor our grandfather's military history. It's beautiful work, but I will never tell him the truth. Story 15. My grandfather was in love with someone in his teens, but things didn't work out. He married my grandmother, and the girl he loved married my grandmother's brother. So they all continued to spend many, many decades together as family. We all grew up knowing them, as there would be massive family reunion picnics. When my grandmother died, in her 90s, my grandfather married the love of his life, who had lost her husband, my grandmother's brother, 2 years prior. They lived several happy years together until his second wife passed away. He tried for love again and married someone we all strongly disliked, a really overbearing, difficult woman. She passed away in the middle of the pandemic from long-term complications. At the time, he was 100 years old, so he decided not to go for a 4th wife. Story 16. I don't know if this counts, but my partner of 4 years has a daughter he hasn't seen since she was very young, around 4 years old maybe. Due to her mother making many efforts to keep him away, and him kind of just moving on with his life, I guess. He ended up getting remarried and had a son, whom he's raising the best he can with shared custody. He did reach out to his daughter's grandparents, who basically raised her, when she was a teenager and left his contact number, but she never got in touch, understandably. She's around 21 now, and I found her on Facebook a couple of years ago and showed him some pictures. It's amazing how much she looks like him. I'm sure he still carries sadness about the whole situation. The family secret part is that I recently got curious about her and checked Facebook again. I discovered that she's engaged and had a baby a couple of months ago, so he's a grandfather and doesn't know it. I figured it's not my place to tell him, since it would probably just make an already painful situation even more difficult. Story 17. Not my family, but my ex's. It always struck me as strange how his parents had a marriage that appeared happy on the surface, but underneath was filled with resentment. My ex mentioned several times how sad it made him that his dad would do certain things that hurt his mother emotionally. For the children, he would go above and beyond, drive hundreds of kilometers, make sacrifices, move mountains. Well, for the sister at least. For my ex, I'm not so sure. It slowly dawned on me that he might be doing these things intentionally to sabotage his wife's happiness. I just couldn't figure out why. I also always found it odd how everyone in the family looked so alike, except for my ex, with his broad head and crooked tooth. One day he told me about his godfather who lives in Canada. After his wife, the best friend of his mother, passed away, he moved there to live in solitude. My ex spoke very highly of him, said they had a special connection. Then he sent me a picture, and suddenly everything made sense. The same broad head, the same forehead with identical wrinkles, the same eye shape, the same chin, and the same crooked tooth. To this day, I am 100% convinced the godfather, the husband of his mother's late best friend, is his real father. And they probably all know, except my ex and his sister. Story 18. My grandmother immigrated to North America from Europe in 1970 and didn't leave Canada until her death in 2017. Until the day she died, everyone who knew her, family or otherwise, believed that she did not speak English, only her mother tongue. She couldn't read, write, or drive, and she didn't get out much. Most of her life was spent indoors, taking care of us grandkids before and after school and church, Mass in her native language. When she suffered a fall in 2007, she was hospitalized for a short time and given pain medication. My mother was with her at the hospital and left the room for a few minutes to grab a cup of coffee. When she returned, my drugged-up grandma was having an entire conversation in English with one of the medical staff, perfectly fluent. I'm the only family member who knows other than my mom. The medical staff thought it was hilarious. As soon as she sobered up from the pain meds, she completely denied it ever happened and stuck to that story for the next decade. Story 19. My mom's favorite cousin committed murder and is on death row. So our cousin, on my grandpa's side, has been in prison in another state my entire life. I'm 25. And my mom has always kept in contact with him. She still does, writing letters, making phone calls, and now even Zoom calls. She didn't tell me until I was in high school that he was in prison for being falsely accused of a murder, which is why he had a death sentence. I recently found out that it wasn't a false accusation. When he was in his teens or early 20s, he wanted to be a rapper and was becoming popular in our area. He was making a lot of money and using a lot of drugs. Apparently one night he was high on coca at a party and accidentally killed our other cousin, on my grandma's side. I can't fully remember what my dad said happened, but I think our cousin pushed her too hard and she hit her head on a glass table or something like that. It's such a complex situation because the cousin in prison is from one side of the family and the cousin who died is from the other. It was really hard on everyone, but a few family members still keep in contact with him. My dad loves spilling the family tea now that I'm old enough. Story 20. My uncle harmed his 2-year-old sister when he was 15. I always kind of disliked the guy. He's been in and out of prison my entire life for DUIs, and he was always arrogant and unpleasant. When I found out about that incident, I was absolutely disgusted. Luckily, I had already cut him out of my life long before learning about it. My mom told me stories of him burying cats up to their necks and harming them with a shovel. Also, my grandma, whom I also cut out of my life a long time ago, only talked to him about it once, saying it was wrong to do something like that to a child. To be honest, I've cut off my entire extended family. They are all dysfunctional. My cousins, my aunts on both sides, my uncle, my grandmother. The only ones who were good people and truly loved me have all passed away. The last one I cared about died when I was 13. The rest of my extended family who are still alive could disappear from my life forever, and I wouldn't care. But for some reason, they just keep going. Story 21. My grandparents weren't exactly saints. Soon after World War II, my grandmother got pregnant and gave birth to a boy. Until a few years ago, when I was 25, I had no idea my grandfather wasn't his biological father. My grandma got pregnant by a German soldier, but they claimed it was an American one, so it would seem more acceptable. After World War II, being with a German, well, since being unmarried and having a baby wasn't acceptable back then, she was forced to marry my grandfather. He was not a kind man. He demanded to eat beef every night while his children went without food, and he cheated numerous times. One of the affairs was with his secretary. He even brought the kids to her house, not knowing what was really going on. Later, he abandoned 10 kids to start a new life in Belgium, leaving my grandma with no money and struggling with diabetes, which was deadly at the time. The children were rehomed. I think that's the right word. My grandma died at 54 due to diabetes. When I was younger, my dad always said Grandpa was dead. Later, he had to admit he was still alive and living in Belgium with his new wife and family. When I was 25, I felt compelled to find him. It was easier than I expected. I called him, but he acted very strange. My aunt later said he was dying. And yes, he stopped eating and said he wanted to die after that phone call. I heard this later. I was the first person to find him and his address. My aunt and I visited a while later, not knowing he had already passed. His wife opened the door and I spoke with her briefly. A woman came from behind, asking who I was. They told the woman behind her that they needed to talk. I later learned that she was the daughter of his new family. I stay in touch with one of them. The other is still too shocked. Yes, he had 2 kids with his new wife, none of whom knew we existed. His wife knew he had been married before, but he always said the kids weren't his, and there I was. I look like both my mom and dad, and my dad looks exactly like his father. She saw it immediately. She recognized me and her husband. The look on their faces was heartbreaking. Sometimes I wish I had left that door closed. His daughters resent him for lying all those years. Story 22. My husband has an aunt and uncle who were married, had 3 kids, divorced in the 90s, then reconciled and had another child. My husband always talked about the time being weird because he spent so much time with that uncle and his cousins during the separation. He even met the girlfriend his uncle dated during the split. I always thought it was amazing that a woman, the aunt, could forgive a man for divorcing her and dating someone else in the meantime. Years later, I mentioned this to my parents. My husband and I come from a somewhat small town where everyone kind of knows each other, but not always very well. I said, "Did you know husband's aunt and uncle got divorced and then got back together?" And my mom replied, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that. He had another child during that time and came back to her." What? My husband and his family never mentioned it. They gossip about everything and everyone, so I find it hard to believe they've kept this secret. I truly believe there's a real chance they don't know. Either that, or everyone was sworn to secrecy due to the elderly parents' health and religious values. Both grandparents recently passed, and at the funeral they made a big deal about the number of grandchildren. I wonder what the uncle was thinking in that moment, knowing his child with the other woman wasn't included. His uncle is not a kind man, and I can't believe the aunt took him back. She's such a good person and deserved better. I never told my husband this information. Story 23. My Uncle Jay used to date a woman who was a S-worker back in his college days. He later met my aunt and they got married, but he was still secretly seeing that woman. She became pregnant and he ended up dropping the baby off at their house. Panicked, he gave the child to his sister, who was married but couldn't have children at the time. So she raised the baby boy as her own. Eventually, Uncle Jay got his wife pregnant, and they had my cousin Jay Jr. The 2 cousins grew up not knowing they were secretly half-brothers, 3 years apart. The child raised by Uncle Jay's sister later had a younger sister, and she also had no idea about the secret. When the boy was a teenager, his biological mother showed up at his door and told him she was actually his real mom. She also revealed that Uncle Jay had stopped giving her money to keep quiet. On top of that, it turned out he had another child, a full sister to the boy, who was raised by their birth mother and sadly groomed into the same line of work. Uncle Jay turned out to be a real mess. His business eventually failed and he went bankrupt. He still tries to act wealthy while constantly borrowing money from everyone. This man will borrow money from you, talk behind your back, and when you ask him to repay you, he'll act like he has no idea what you're talking about. Meanwhile, one of my other cousins grew up to party excessively, often getting blackout drunk and hooking up with random guys around town. One day she got pregnant and had no idea who the father was. As the child grew up, the resemblance to Uncle Jay became concerning. Story 24. My grandfather and grandmother on my father's side were both Sami, Norwegian indigenous people, and during the 1940s, when the Germans occupied Norway, They saw it as an opportunity to get revenge on the local Norwegian authorities. My grandmother began spreading rumors about several local families being communists, and even went as far as forging letters that she personally delivered to the German garrison. As a result, several people were arrested, beaten, and sent to various concentration camps. A few were even executed to serve as a warning to others. As shocking as this is, it gets worse. In their hate-fueled desire for revenge against the local authorities, and society in general, which had treated Sami people terribly for centuries, my grandparents and a group of others went even further. Toward the end of the war, when the Germans were evacuating, they helped murder several Norwegian resistance fighters. They hid the bodies in a bog they knew well and swore never to speak of it again. The secret remained buried for decades. But eventually the guilt became too much for my grandmother. After my grandfather passed away from illness, she wrote everything down in a series of letters and locked them in the family safe alongside their most treasured belongings. When she died, my father and his two brothers opened the safe and found the letters, along with actual documents from the German military, a large stash of what could only be described as blood money, and two wallets that had belonged to the murdered resistance fighters. What's so disturbing about all this is that the Germans treated the Sami just as poorly as the Norwegian state had. But I suppose hatred, especially when passed down through generations, can blind people in the worst ways imaginable. Story 25. In 1967, when my aunt was 16, she had a summer job doing clerical work in an office. She lived with her family in a small town in New York State. I believe she was already seeing the man who would become her abusive husband. One afternoon, while alone in the office, she was assaulted by a stranger. I'm not sure if she became pregnant and had an abortion. My other aunt hinted at it once, but she's no longer with us. The man was described in the typical way used to shift blame, and after 50 years of whispered retellings by her sisters, who often lie or exaggerate, it's hard to say what's true. Maybe she doesn't even know anymore. Besides that, it was a man. But to this day, she harbors deep resentment toward black men. It runs so deep that she once reported a man and got him fired and deported just because her sister had feelings for him and he was black. I've heard her say things like, "What would our family say?" She had social standing, and that gave her power to act this way without consequences. I've never heard her use racial slurs, but her feelings are as disturbing as they are strong. Her husband of 53 years is abusive. He pinches her, spills food on her, pulls her hair, and has been unfaithful throughout their marriage. I've heard he even coerced her into things she wasn't comfortable with. But because he provided financially and she lacked self-esteem, she maintained the illusion that her life was perfect. She had wealth, her kids went to prestigious camps, she took cruises often, but beneath it all was pain. The unspoken theory is that she kept her assault a secret because she feared her husband would react violently if he ever found out she had been hurt before they married. Damaged goods in his eyes. There was fear he would completely destroy her emotionally and financially. I've held this secret in for 50 years. Saying it out loud makes me feel lighter. Story 26. My dad used to joke that our family was formerly Mormon, but we got better. The truth behind that joke is disturbing. My grandma's stepfather was a dangerous man, and he held a leadership position in the youth division of the Mormon temple. My grandma and her sisters either married out or ran away in their teens. In their 20s, as married women, they wrote letters to the Mormon church detailing the harm he had caused to children. Nothing was done. He remained in that position until he retired and eventually passed away in his 90s during the 1990s. The church never acted on those accusations, but instead chose to pressure and shame my grandma and her sisters. He continued to have access to children for the rest of his life. What's worse is that my family still let him come to holiday events. He was still married to my great-grandmother. There was even a long-standing family feud because my grandma had warned one of her daughters about him, but not the other. The best reasoning I could ever get from anyone was, "It's family. It's complicated. You can't be rude. Go along to get along, I guess." I, however, aspire to be as rude as needed when it comes to protecting others. Story 27. It's not a scandalous secret, but it's one that changed my life. Over the summer, my aunt let slip that when I was 16, about 14 years ago, my mom had stage 3 esophageal cancer. At the time, my dad and aunt played it down. I knew my mom was sick, but not how serious it really was. The part that really shook me was learning that my mom wrote a letter to give me after her death. That same day, she made the decision that she wasn't going to miss out on my life. She was going to fight and survive, and she did. I don't know if she tore up the letter or if it's buried somewhere in their house for me to find one day. I've never mentioned to either of my parents that I know about it. Maybe it's just the resurfacing of emotions I buried back when she was ill, when I was so terrified of losing her. But it breaks my heart to think she ever had to write that letter. We came so close to losing her, and I had no idea. I've spent the last decade taking her for granted. I see my mom differently now. I always knew she was strong, but never realized just how incredibly strong she truly is. Story 28. My paternal grandpa didn't die in a war before my dad was even born. Grandma actually kicked him out shortly after my dad's birth for an unexplained reason and told everyone he had died. She changed her last name back to her maiden name, gave my dad that same maiden name, which is how I have it too, and never spoke to her ex-husband again or let him meet his son. My dad spent the majority of his life believing his father had died. Grandma only told him the truth on her deathbed a few years ago. By then, Grandpa had already passed away. He died in 2009. Apparently, he was a fairly well-known professor of mathematics and even wrote a few math textbooks. The whole experience was surreal to me. I can only imagine how my dad must have felt. And no, we never found out why she kicked him out. Story 29. I'll leave out specific details to avoid doxing myself. Long story short, my dad is Hapa, part Hawaiian and part European. He has a European last name, but it's spelled in a really strange way that doesn't match the original origin. We've even been corrected by strangers in public, saying we were mispronouncing it. I recently discovered the reason why, and I haven't told my dad. After doing some deep digging, I found my great-great-great-grandfather who came to Hawaii from Europe, bringing the name to the islands. Here's the twist. He was the only one from my dad's side with both a photo and an obituary available. His last name was spelled differently in various documents. I kept researching and found a wild article from a few years ago in a peer-reviewed historical journal that explained why. My great-great-great-grandfather had been a spy involved in the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. He intentionally changed the spelling of his last name to further protect his identity. I guess I have a traitor in my blood. Figured my dad probably wouldn't want to know. Story 30. My biological grandfather's name was always kept from me. The last time he was seen by his second family, yes, us, he was trying to kidnap my mother. It was 1963 in South Carolina. My grandmother let him get drunk and pass out, then packed up the kids and went to her mother's house. 3 days later, my mom was playing outside when he came driving down the road. He stopped and tried to grab her. That's when my great-grandmother came to the door with a double-barrel shotgun. She didn't say a word, no warning, no yelling. She just opened fire on his car and shouted, "You move with that baby and I'll blow your head off." He dropped my mom, ran to his car, and she put 2 more rounds into it as he sped off. I was never allowed to know his name, but about a year ago I did the Ancestry.com thing and found a cousin, along with his name. Doing some research made me angry for my grandmother because that man was a known womanizer. I reached out to the cousin and was told, "We don't talk about Pa's second family." I responded, "Well, I have some genetic and health information I think the women in your family should know." And I told her and left it at that. Honestly, it's probably best we don't know too much about who me and my mom take after. Story 31. My aunt and grandma both had multiple miscarriages. It fundamentally shaped how they raised their children, but in completely opposite ways. My grandmother developed classic abusive narcissistic tendencies in an attempt to control her children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. I'm still trying to process and work through that trauma, especially because my father continued that cycle of abuse. It's how he was raised. On the other hand, my aunt is the most loving parent I've ever seen. She showers my cousins with affection and genuinely celebrates who they are. You can feel how precious her children are to her, and it honestly hurts a little to witness. I wish I didn't know the backstory sometimes. I occupy this strange space in my family where I'm old enough that people feel comfortable confiding in me, but not old enough to influence anything. It makes me feel like I'm on the outside, more of a detached observer than a real participant in the family dynamic. Story 32. My great-uncle should be in prison for what he did, and so should my grandma's ex-husband. Also, mental illness absolutely runs in my family. For years, I was told no one had any idea where my mental health struggles came from, until I had my first crisis at 15. While in the hospital during a talk with my parents and a psychiatrist, the psychiatrist asked if there was any family history of mental illness. And just like that, my parents laid it all out. Apparently, yes, there were family members who had taken their own lives, others who had tried, and a whole list of diagnoses, disorders, and addictions that run through the family. So it wasn't just me. We have a long, messy history of serious problems. Honestly, everyone in my family could use therapy. Every single one of them. Also, we apparently have family members we've shunned. Who are we? The Amish. We're just shunning people now. I've known the reasons for my parents' divorce since I was a kid because my dad would get drunk and rant about it, and still does. It honestly seems like everyone in this family is abusive in some way. I feel like I need a new family. Someone, please adopt me. And somehow my favorite family member isn't even related to me. He's my aunt's ex-husband. He definitely has trauma, but he's nowhere near as messed up as the rest of them. I miss him every day. Sometimes I think about visiting him just to tell him how much he meant to me growing up, but I'm not sure if that would be weird. I'm 18 now, and he's only one plane ride away. And he did get the dog in the divorce. Story 33. My grandfather served 2 tours in Vietnam. After returning, he once took my grandmother to a party at a bar near the local Navy base. Those events were pretty common. They left their 3 kids at home, either with a sitter or under the care of my uncle, who was the oldest. At the party, my grandfather had 2 drinks of Crown Royal, his drink of choice since Vietnam. He was a big guy, so 2 drinks wasn't much for him. But on the drive home, a police officer tried to pull him over, which escalated into a high-speed chase through the woods. He flipped his brand-new, custom-ordered Cadillac, only 2 weeks old. It turns out someone had drugged him with liquid LSD. Both he and my grandmother ended up in the hospital, and the whole thing turned into a legal mess that lasted for weeks. During that time, the kids had to stay with various relatives. My grandfather had smoked weed once in Vietnam and had a terrible experience, so he never willingly touched any drugs after that. He passed away last year, never knowing that I had heard the full story. He always told people he had just fallen asleep at the wheel. His daughter, however, is convinced it was some kind of government experiment, but she's schizophrenic, so that theory should probably be taken with a grain of salt. Story 34. My mother had an affair with her best friend's husband. Back then, she and I had our own place, but we would often stay at this couple's house for weeks at a time. They had kids, and another woman lived there with her own child. All of us kids would hang out, do homework, eat together, and play outside. It felt like having a group of siblings or cousins, which was great for me because at home I was an only child. Looking back, I think it might have started as some kind of group arrangement, maybe swinging or threesomes, but it eventually turned into my mom and the husband having a secret thing of their own. One day, during one of our weeks at home, the wife came to our door while the husband was there. They had a big talk, and after that, we never saw them again. Of course, none of this has ever been talked about. They probably assume I don't remember since I was just a kid, but I was reading Shakespeare by the time I was 7, so they should have known I was more observant than most kids. Fortunately for them, I had learned by the time I was 5 to keep my nose in a book and my mouth shut. That's what you do when your life is surrounded by irresponsible adults. The craziest part? All these people were, and still are, deeply involved in church. I should really write a book. The bottom line is, that entire experience played a part in why I'm definitely an atheist now. Story 35. One time I went to stay with my aunt and uncle, along with my mom. I stayed at their house while my mom went to see some of her old high school friends. As I was getting ready for bed, I overheard my aunt, who isn't related to her, talking to my uncle about how my mom is weird and how annoyed she was that we went to a lower-class restaurant. It was literally a 4-star place. She also said my uncle should stop spoiling my mom. For context, my aunt and uncle are extremely wealthy with 1 child. At the time, my mom and I were really struggling, living paycheck to paycheck after my dad used all our savings on drugs. My uncle and my mom have always been close since their mom basically ignored them both growing up. He tried to explain our situation to his wife, but she kept saying things like, "She dresses so nice and her hair's always done. Do you really believe they're struggling? She's after our money." Then she stormed out of the house. I peeked out and saw my uncle. He knew I had heard everything. He looked so upset that I overheard. I've never told my mom because I know it would ruin the only family she has left. I don't think I ever will, but it was jarring to take that in. Story 36. My gran has removed all of my mother's siblings from her will without telling them, leaving only my mom and dad as the sole beneficiaries. Her siblings only check in when they need something, and they've done that for years. During COVID, they'd call once a month just to talk about themselves, despite knowing she lives alone, has mobility issues, and is generally very lonely. My family takes care of her daily. My mom is her full-time caregiver, and my dad, brother, and I help out whenever we can. Toward the end of the pandemic, my gran told my mom she was changing her will. No one questioned it. It's her money and her house, and she can do as she wants. A few months ago, she told me privately that she's cut everyone else out and has written letters to each of them explaining her decision. She's decided my parents will inherit everything, and I'll receive the teddy bear my grandfather gave her on their first date because she knows I'll take care of it. It's going to be complete chaos when she passes. Story 37. When my mom was little, she used to visit her grandparents on her dad's side often. She was always told not to open a certain closet. Naturally, curiosity got the best of her, and one day she looked inside and saw white robes and strange hats. Confused, she asked her grandmother about what she saw. Instead of explaining, her grandmother scolded her for going in the closet and told her not to worry about it. Later, she overheard her grandparents discussing whether or not they should tell her what it was. They decided it was best not to. A few weeks later, in history class, the topic was the KKK. My mom said her jaw nearly hit the desk when she realized what she had seen. She confronted her grandparents again, and her grandfather confessed that he had been one of the 12 grand wizards of the KKK. My mom was never raised to be racist. Her own mother wasn't racist. None of our family is, except apparently her grandfather. She told me the story in confidence, saying I was the first person she ever told. So, oops. Story 38. I recently found out that my uncle isn't actually my uncle. He's biologically my mom's cousin. His mother and younger sister were brutally murdered when he was 6 years old. He only survived because he was able to barricade himself in his bedroom. The man who killed them had gone on a few dates with his mom, but after she ended things, he started stalking her. She had told my grandma to take care of her kids if anything ever happened to her. Both his mother and sister were assaulted, bitten, and strangled. The killer then set the apartment on fire to cover it up, but my great-uncle, who lived in the same building, discovered the scene while checking to make sure everyone had evacuated. My uncle had severe smoke inhalation, but he survived. The murderer was identified by the bite marks he left on both victims. To this day, my uncle's wife and children have no idea what happened. They believe my grandma, his aunt, is actually his mother. Story 39. I am the family secret. I was put up for adoption by my birth mother, who was 16 at the time. My birth father denied responsibility and left her in a very tough spot. This was right after Roe v. Wade passed, so there was another option, but I'm glad she chose to carry me to term. We've recently reconnected thanks to one of those DNA kits. Because my birth father denied involvement, he never told his family. When I reached out to them recently, they had no idea I existed. I have a strong feeling they think I'm after something, which isn't true, but I get why they'd be cautious. My biological father passed away sometime during my late teens. From what I've gathered, there's a lot they aren't telling me about him. I found out I have 3 half-siblings on his side from 2 different women. I also have a half-sister on my birth mom's side, and we've built an amazing relationship over the past year. The part that makes this all more complicated is that I haven't told the family that raised me. Sadly, they're the kind of people who wouldn't have supported my DNA search, let alone celebrated that I found answers. They're the type to suck the joy out of something just because it wasn't on their terms. And as much as I love them, I refuse to let them ruin this for me. Story 40. Well, compared to everything else I've read here, this is pretty mild, but my parents have been secretly covering most of my sister's bills and one of my brother's student loans. My brother-in-law makes decent money, but they spend way more than they can afford and take multiple big vacations each year. I'm pretty sure my parents are going to end up paying for my niece's school trip to Paris because they can't swing the $300. Most of the trip is covered by fundraising, and my niece is working now too, but I doubt they'll make her pay. My brother makes great money but has a habit of making questionable financial decisions and just doesn't know how to manage money. My parents co-signed on his loans, and after he stopped paying for 2 years, they took them over. It's been a mess. I'm not supposed to know any of this, but I'm not oblivious. My dad was making more money than was ever showing up in the bank, and money was always tight. I live with them, and despite not earning much, I contribute as much as I can. So I did a little snooping and found bills, receipts, and more. I'm honestly upset. My parents should be financially comfortable in retirement, but instead, my mom is constantly stressed. The other secret? I've been named trustee of their wills and, if needed, power of attorney. My sister will absolutely lose it. Even though I make the least money of all my siblings, I'm the only one who's financially responsible. Story 41. I was 17 and had just gotten home from working at a restaurant around 1 a.m. on a Saturday night. This was the mid-70s, and back then, parents partied. When I walked into the kitchen, my mom and a male family friend were sitting there talking and looked visibly nervous when I came in. I asked where my dad was, and my mom said, "He went to bed." I didn't ask where the friend's wife was, but I figured it out pretty quickly. I went upstairs to brush my teeth before bed. The bathroom was next to the master bedroom. I started hearing noises coming from the bedroom. Being a bit naive at the time, it took me a moment to realize that what I was hearing was not just someone sleeping, there was definitely something intimate going on in there. I went back downstairs and confronted my mom. She said, "Nothing's going on," but I wasn't buying it. I must have caused a bit of a scene because it wasn't long before my dad came storming downstairs, angry that I had interrupted his, evening plans. He claimed innocence, of course. That night was never spoken about again. I didn't even tell my siblings until now. Both my dad and the other woman have since passed, but my mom and the male family friend are still close friends, both now widowed. Honestly, I kind of wish they'd just get together at this point and enjoy their final years. Story 42. A friend of mine from school once shared a secret that still gives me chills. She had left school early one day and went home. No one was there, so she went out to the backyard to have a smoke. After a minute, she heard voices inside the house. She hid around the corner and peeked through a window. It was her older brother and her aunt. Now they were close, only about 7 or 8 years apart, so she didn't think much of it at first. She figured they were just chatting. She was about to open the patio door and walk in when she saw her brother take off his shirt. He sat next to their aunt and they started kissing. She froze. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then he laid on top of her, and the kissing became more intense. Not knowing what else to do, she quietly walked around to the front of the house and rang the doorbell. Her brother answered, slightly out of breath. She greeted him awkwardly and went into the kitchen, where her aunt was sitting at the table, looking flushed. She grabbed something from the fridge and went straight to her room. She never got the courage to ask either of them about what she saw, but over time, she began to believe that it probably wasn't the first time. Story 43. My family moved down to Florida, where I currently live, from New York. My grandfather never really looked like other grandfathers I'd seen. He had a mullet, tattoos, and was kind of passive-aggressive, but I didn't think too much of it. A few years ago, my mom told me that my grandfather was a member of the Gambino crime family on Long Island. If you've seen Goodfellas, you know what I'm talking about. It's kind of cool, but also terrifying to think about. I don't really see him anymore. He says he paints houses, but we're pretty sure that's code. He also goes to church regularly, probably to ask forgiveness for all the things he's done. We don't know exactly what those things are, but my mom once told me he borrowed her car back when they still lived in New York and returned it with bullet holes in the doors. So I think it's safe to assume he's been involved in some violent situations. We also suspect he's cheating on my grandmother, which wouldn't be shocking given the history of that lifestyle. I don't think my grandparents know that I know. It's probably the biggest family secret I've been keeping. Story 44. After my parents split up, my dad stayed single for a long time. One day I was alone at his house and grabbed his iPad to put on some music. The first thing I saw after unlocking the screen were his Facebook Messenger chats. Out of curiosity, I scrolled through them and saw tons of messages from women. Most of them said similar things like, "I saw you on Tinder, Badoo, happened, but we didn't match. I just wanted to let you know I'm really interested." It was basically a flood of messages, with my dad making desperate attempts to connect with women. Another time I borrowed his car. Just like his house, it was filled with random stuff: paperwork, pens, bags, groceries. While driving, a big white envelope slid out from under the passenger seat. I put it back where it came from. But curiosity got the best of me. Inside, I found it was full of oxazepam/Seresta benzodiazepines. Nobody in the family knew my dad was on medication. He once told me he was taking something for high blood pressure. At that point, he had been using these meds for over a year. My dad has a lot of secrets no one else knows. That much is clear. I just don't know how deep it goes. One secret that isn't hidden is that, during his marriage to my mom, he had a mistress in another country where he was working. My mom found out by checking his email. He forgot to log out. In the messages, he told the other woman that the mother of his kids had left him and that my mom was just the cleaning lady. She was devastated. While he worked overseas, she stayed behind, raising us like a nanny in her own home. Story 45. My maternal grandmother tried to poison all 6 of her kids, except for the baby, when they were young. My mother was the oldest, around preteen age, and she remembers it clearly. The poison was in their food and they all got violently sick but survived. Ever since then, my grandmother has treated her children with cruelty, probably because her plan didn't work. My uncle and favorite aunt by marriage lived with us for many years. It wasn't until I was an adult that I learned my favorite uncle had an entirely separate family in Mexico. It hurt more than I expected because my aunt couldn't have children and they were in the process of adopting. Meanwhile, he had 3 kids with another woman. My paternal grandmother acts holier than thou now, but when she was younger, she got pregnant at a very early age, had my dad, and then left his father. She told my dad that another man was his father, and he believed that his whole life until adulthood. He eventually found out his real dad was dying of cancer, and that he had 2 brothers he never knew about. Story 46. My grandfather's biological father had severe arthritis, just like my grandfather, but it's said he hated living that way and died very young. He was a preacher, and we later found letters exchanged between him, my father's grandfather, and my mother's grandmother. My grandfather's mother eventually remarried, but she became an abusive alcoholic. She would lock my grandfather, his brother, and their stepbrother in the basement for days at a time. My grandfather's brother says he was molested by their stepfather, but my grandfather claims it never happened to him. My grandmother, however, says she thinks he's lying. My grandfather was a tough man. He left home and school in the 8th grade and built a life for himself from nothing. I've always suspected there were more family secrets buried there, and I think at some point he may have been involved in organized crime. He used to buy cars from Montreal, drive them 4 hours to our rural town, fix them up, and sell them. I always thought he just loved cars, but before he passed, I asked him about it. He told me he never even liked cars. It was just a way to provide for the family. I also think he knew he was going to die. The day before it happened, he sold off all his stocks. His death was completely unexpected for the rest of us. Story 47. Mom's side of the family. My grandma was always this hilarious, foul-mouthed, loving woman to me. She lived in San Francisco and was openly gay. After she passed, my aunt told me that she had been a terrible mother. She just didn't have a maternal bone in her body, but she wasn't a bad person, just forced into a role she wasn't meant to fill. She had drunkenly confessed to my mom, her eldest child, that she wasn't meant to be a woman, let alone a mother. Because of that, she was institutionalized multiple times throughout the 1950s and 60s. While still married to my grandpa, she was caught several times with other men's wives. Eventually, she fled Japan with another woman, leaving her kids behind and resettling in San Francisco. My mom was left to raise all her siblings. By the time I was born, only about half of her siblings still spoke to Grandma. When I was 21, she died. We were told she passed away naturally, but my aunt later told me she had taken her own life and that I should never mention it. My siblings know our grandma was gay and struggled to keep relationships with her kids, but no one ever talks about the reasons why. Dad's side of the family. My great-grandmother immigrated here, but no one really knows from where. My grandmother used to proudly claim we descended from a ship from England before the American Revolution. But we've since discovered that the family tree my great-grandmother wrote was a complete fabrication. In reality, she was a Jewish woman who hid her heritage to assimilate more easily into American society. She moved through several countries before arriving in Canada and then the US. The paper trail is thin, but we found a few letters that gave us some clues. My sister took a DNA test, and it turns out we have no English ancestry whatsoever. My dad's side of the family refuses to believe this, despite all the evidence.